At 1:50 in the afternoon on July 4, 1943, radar operators on Rendova Island detected more than 80 enemy aircraft approaching from the northwest. 2 days earlier, another Japanese formation had arrived over that same beach without warning. Some men on the beach looked up and, for a fatal handful of seconds, mistook the twin-engine bombers for friendly American B-25s. Then the bombs began to fall. By the end of that afternoon, one official American Marine history would record 64 dead and about 89 wounded. Bombs striking a congested beachhead, fuel and ammunition stores burning, a gelignite dump exploding, a field medical station taking a direct hit. After the raid, Seabees on the devastated peninsula gave the place a name that quickly spread among the Americans. Suicide Point. This is the true story of the 9th Defense Battalion, and the afternoon 88 90mm shells produced one of the most disputed and extraordinary anti-aircraft claims of the entire Pacific War. To understand what happened on that beach, you have to understand where it sat in the geography of a war that had been grinding across the South Pacific for 18 months. The Solomon Islands stretch across the ocean like the vertebrae of some vast sleeping animal. They begin near the Bismarck Archipelago in the northwest and trail southeast toward the New Hebrides. Between them run the currents and channels that American sailors and airmen would eventually give their own names to: the Slot, Iron Bottom Sound, the graveyards of ships lost in the darkness of tropical nights. They are not, on any map, a place of great importance. They are small islands, volcanic, jungled, ringed by reefs that will tear the bottom out of a landing craft that misjudges the tide. They produce copra and timber and not much else. Before the war, they belonged to a British protectorate that most Americans would have struggled to locate. By the summer of 1942, they had become the hinge on which the entire Pacific War would turn. Guadalcanal had been the first vertebra taken back from the Empire of Japan. From August of 1942 through February of 1943, American Marines, soldiers, sailors, and Marine and Navy aviators had fought one of the most brutal campaigns of the entire war on and around that single island. 6 months of savage fighting, naval battles fought in narrow waters at pistol range, Marine infantry holding a perimeter around a captured airfield while their food ran out and their ammunition dwindled and malaria worked through the ranks like a second enemy. A campaign that ended, when it finally ended, with the Empire of Japan withdrawing what was left of its forces under cover of darkness, and the American Marines on the beach at Cape Esperance discovering that the enemy who had held them at bay for months had simply vanished into the night. When it was over, the strategic momentum in the South Pacific had begun to shift, but it had shifted only barely. Beyond Guadalcanal lay New Georgia, beyond New Georgia lay Bougainville, and beyond Bougainville lay Rabaul itself, the great Japanese fortress that anchored the entire southern front. Rabaul was more than a base. It was a complex of 5 airfields, a superb natural harbor, coastal defenses, anti-aircraft batteries, and tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers, sailors, and airmen. From Rabaul, the Empire of Japan projected power across the entire South Pacific. Bombers based there struck at Allied shipping and airfields from northern Australia to the eastern Solomons. The Japanese Naval Air Arm operating from Rabaul had been, for 18 months of war, one of the most feared instruments of Japanese power. To break Rabaul, the Americans had to work their way up the Solomons. To take New Georgia, they had to first take the island just across Blanche Channel from its western shore. Rendova, a muddy, jungled scrap of land, 7 miles long and 3 miles wide, ringed by coral and swamp. On the maps at headquarters in Noumea, it was a stepping stone. On the ground, it was hell. Rendova mattered because of geography. From its northern shore, American artillery could reach across the channel to Munda Point on New Georgia. Munda held the Japanese airfield the Americans needed to seize before they could push any further up the Solomons. Long-range American guns positioned on Rendova could pound Munda day and night, could keep the Japanese defenders under continuous fire, could soften up the beaches where the eventual invasion force would land. But those guns first had to be landed and set up and protected. That protection was the job of the 9th Defense Battalion. On June 30, 1943, American forces waded ashore under sporadic rifle fire. Among them were the American Marines of the 9th Defense Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel William J. Shire. Shire was 43 years old, a career American Marine officer who had assumed command of the experienced 9th Defense Battalion shortly before the New Georgia campaign. The battalion itself had a longer history, having been formed at Paris Island, trained at Guantanamo Bay, and served on Guadalcanal before Rendova. American Marine Defense battalions were a particular kind of unit. They had been created between the wars when the Marine Corps had begun preparing for the possibility of a Pacific War against Japan. Their job was not to storm beaches. Their job was to defend islands that had already been taken. They came ashore with the assault troops. They set up their guns. They protected the airfields and supply dumps and harbors that the infantry Marines had captured. When the infantry moved on to the next island, the defense battalion stayed behind, watching the sky. Now, under Shire's command, the battalion faced a new and specific mission on Rendova. Their orders were straightforward. Set up 90mm anti-aircraft guns. Cover the beach, cover the supply ships, cover the massive 155mm long Tom artillery pieces that would soon be shelling Giuseppe's positions across the channel. Build a defensive umbrella no Japanese aircraft could penetrate. They had the tools, in theory, 90mm M1 guns, each weighing over 8 tons, each capable of hurling a 24-pound shell to a ceiling of 33,000 feet. A long-range SCR-270 warning radar, shorter-range fire control radars including the SCR-268B designed to feed data to Sperry M4 mechanical gun directors. On paper, it was a revolution. In practice, it was something else entirely. The 90mm M1 anti-aircraft gun was one of the finest weapons of its kind in the world in 1943. It could fire high-explosive shells to ceilings of over 30,000 feet at rates that trained crews could sustain for extended engagements. It was accurate, well-engineered, and reliable. American Marine and Army anti-aircraft units across the Pacific and Europe would come to depend on it as the backbone of their heavy anti-aircraft defense. The gun had been developed in the late 1930s to replace older 3-inch anti-aircraft weapons that had been in service since the First World War. Its designers had understood something the previous generation had not, that the next war would be fought at higher altitudes, at faster speeds against aircraft carrying heavier bomb loads than anything the world had ever seen. The 90mm M1 was their answer. A 24-pound shell hurled by a full-length cartridge case could reach altitudes that the old 3-inch could only dream of, and the barrel, the mount, and the recoil mechanism had all been engineered to sustain the kind of continuous fire that a modern air attack would demand. But no gun, however accurate, could shoot down what its crew could not see. The SCR-268B was one of the earliest gun-laying radars in American service. Developed in the late 1930s and pushed into wartime production, it could provide useful range, bearing, and elevation data. But its measurements were not precise enough to guarantee a hit. Even with radar and a mechanical director, most shells fired at a moving aircraft would miss. The set had been designed originally for a different purpose. Its earliest role had been to control searchlights, sweeping the sky over defended positions and pinning enemy aircraft in beams of light. That would then guide human gunners aiming through optical sights. That was the concept in the mid-1930s. It had been an advance over what came before. But someone in Washington had decided the SCR-268 could also control anti-aircraft guns. That was the leap. That was the ambition. Take a radar built for one job and use it for another. Trust that the same set of measurements that could point a searchlight could also, if fed into a mechanical computer, aim a 9-ton cannon at an aircraft 5 miles away. The theory was reasonable. The practice was harder than the theory. The Sperry M4 director was the other half of the system. It was a mechanical analog computer, a device of gears and cams and precision mechanical linkages. Its job was to take the range and bearing and altitude of an aircraft, factor in the aircraft's course and speed, calculate where that aircraft would be by the time a shell reached its altitude, and translate all of that into elevations and traverse and fuse settings for the guns. That is a lot of mathematics for a machine made of brass gears. The Sperry M4 could do it, but it was slow. It had been engineered in a decade when engineers thought differently about time. A gunner in 1935, watching for enemy aircraft through binoculars, could afford to take a few seconds to call out ranges. In 1943, seconds were the difference between a hit and a miss. A Japanese bomber flying at 260 miles per hour crossed nearly 400 feet in 1 second. A shell taking 18 seconds to reach 10,000 feet had to be aimed at empty sky, at the point where the bomber would be, not where it was now. The Sperry M4 had originally been engineered for optical tracking. That was how gunners in the 1930s had expected to fight air attacks. Feeding it electronic radar data was awkward and slow. The connection worked after a fashion, but every step in the chain introduced the possibility of error. Radar range measurement, radar bearing measurement, radar elevation measurement, transmission of those measurements to the director, mechanical calculation of the intercept, transmission of the intercept solution to the gun, adjustment of the gun's elevation and traverse, setting of the shell's fuse, loading, firing, flight of the shell, detonation. Each step took time. Each step introduced small errors. And any bomber worth its salt was maneuvering, changing altitude, changing speed, doing everything it could to make the mathematics behind it useless. Every American Marine gunner on Rendova knew all this. Every American Marine gunner on Rendova also knew that this awkward, imperfect system was the only thing standing between them and the bombers coming out of the northwest. 400 miles to the northwest, on the northeastern tip of New Britain, the great Japanese naval and air complex at Rabaul sprawled across a natural volcanic harbor. From Rabaul, Japanese medium bombers could reach out across the Solomon Sea. Aircraft would often be staged forward through bases at Buka, Buin, Kahili, and the Shortland Islands before striking American positions in the central Solomons. The naval air groups operating from Rabaul in the summer of 1943 included some of the most experienced bomber and fighter units in the Imperial Japanese Navy. They had been operating in the region since before the war began. Their crews had been through Java, through the Philippines, through Guadalcanal. They had lost heavily in the great naval air battles of 1942, but the men who remained were veterans. American observers on Rendova would identify the aircraft that came at them as Mitsubishi G4M bombers, the type Americans nicknamed the Betty. Later comparisons with Japanese records suggest that the attacking formation on July 4th may in fact have been Army Ki-21 heavy bombers called the Sally, flown by the 14th Sentai. The exact identification remains debated by historians. Whichever aircraft came at Rendova, their crews had been operating in the Solomons for months, and American anti-aircraft fire had rarely done them serious harm. On the 2nd of July, that pattern held. The morning of July 2nd on Rendova began beneath heavy rain and low cloud. The weather was so poor that the Allied fighter umbrella covering the island was recalled to its bases. Rendova's warning system was not yet fully installed. One American Marine radar set was temporarily inoperative after diesel fuel had mistakenly been poured into the gasoline tank of its motor generator. It was one failure among several. The warning network of an amphibious beachhead was a fragile thing in the middle years of the Pacific War. It depended on radars that had to be brought ashore, unloaded from landing craft, hauled through the mud to positions selected in advance, wired to fire control networks that were still being strung, and calibrated by technicians who had crossed the Pacific in the holds of transport ships. Any part of that chain could fail. On the morning of July 2nd, several parts had, but when the bombers arrived, it meant Rendova would have almost no warning at all. Shortly after the sky began to clear in the early afternoon, the Japanese bombers came. Some men on the beach initially mistook the twin-engine bombers for friendly B-25s. The heavy anti-aircraft batteries were unable to bring effective fire onto the enemy before the attack struck the beach. Bombs struck the congested beachhead, igniting fuel and ammunition stores. Then the gelignite dump exploded. Fuel and ammunition stores caught fire, spreading explosions through a beachhead crowded with men, vehicles, weapons, and supplies. Gelignite is a form of industrial high explosive, similar to dynamite. It had been landed to support engineering operations, demolition of obstacles, and construction work on the beach. It had been stored, like most beachhead supplies in the first days of an amphibious landing, in whatever spot could be cleared for it. Rendova's northern peninsula was small. The trees came almost to the waterline. Space for dumps and depots was limited, and the amount of material coming ashore in the first days after a landing always outpaced the pace at which it could be dispersed inland. The result, on that muddy peninsula, was concentration. Fuel drums stacked near ammunition crates stacked near vehicles parked near medical stations, everything packed tight against the tree line because there was nowhere else to put it. On the afternoon of July 2nd, that storage went up. According to the official American Marine history, the explosion of that stored high explosive caused more casualties and damage in the immediate area than the Japanese bombs themselves. The medical clearing station took a direct hit. American Marines, soldiers, sailors, Seabees, and Navy corpsmen moved into the burning area to pull out the wounded as ammunition and fuel continued to cook off around them. That work is not something most histories linger on. It happens in the aftermath of every attack. It is what medical corpsmen and stretcher bearers do while the rest of the battlefield is still on fire. They go in, they find the wounded, they carry them out. Some of them make it back, some of them do not. The casualty reports would take days to fully compile. By the time the raid ended, one official American Marine history recorded 64 Americans dead and about 89 wounded. Medical reports placed the total number killed or injured at well over 200. Different Navy and Army records recorded slightly different totals. The final numbers would depend on which report you read, and when it had been prepared, and which units it had counted. What every report agreed on was that the beach had been mauled. 2 American Marine 155mm guns from Battery A were damaged. One of them was pinned in place by a Japanese bomb that had fallen between the trail legs of the gun mount and failed to detonate. An unexploded bomb, sitting in the mud between the legs of an American cannon. The gun could not be fired and could not be moved until an ordnance crew was able to remove the bomb and destroy it safely. The specialists who did that work performed it under conditions that would define courage in any language. Ordnance disposal in the Pacific War was still an evolving profession. The men who did it were trained in principles and procedures, but every unexploded bomb was a puzzle. Which fuse had it been armed with? Whether the fall had disturbed the fuse mechanism, whether the bomb was booby-trapped, whether moving it would set it off. Every decision had to be made in the presence of the thing itself. One measurement at a time, one careful movement at a time, with the knowledge that a mistake would mean death for the man doing the work and probably for anyone within 50 yards of him. Somewhere on Rendova on July 2nd, an ordnance crew went out to the Battery A gun with an unexploded Japanese bomb between its trail legs. They did what they had been trained to do. They did it carefully. They did it correctly. The bomb was removed and destroyed. The gun eventually returned to service. The names of the men who did that work do not appear in most histories. After the raid, Seabees on the devastated peninsula gave the place a name that quickly spread among the Americans. Suicide Point. The name captured the fear surrounding a beach where men and supplies remained exposed to further attack. It was the kind of name that spreads without being formally chosen. Every American on Rendova heard it. Every American on Rendova understood it. Every supply ship that came in past the northern shore had to unload where those bodies had been recovered. And every man who stepped off a landing craft looked at the black scars on the sand and knew what they meant. Whatever orders passed through the 9th Defense Battalion that night, the task before them was unmistakable. The warning and fire control network had to be operational before the Japanese returned. Through July 3rd and into the 4th, radar and communications personnel continued installing equipment and resplicing telephone lines whenever they were damaged. By July 4th, the battalion's air control and reporting system was operating. The work was not glamorous. It was cable being unrolled through the mud. It was equipment being tested and brought online while other men on the beach continued the tasks of digging in, moving supplies, and preparing for whatever the next attack would bring. The men doing the work were technicians, radio operators, radar operators, fire direction specialists. They had trained for months to do jobs that most of the country had never heard of. They spoke a language of vacuum tubes and waveguides, of azimuth and elevation and slant range, of parallel circuits and grounded connections. They knew that if they got it wrong, the guns they served would be firing blind. And they knew that if they got it right, everyone on the beach might live to see another sunrise. None of that work makes it into most war histories. That work helped make the defense of July 4th possible. The Japanese made another attempt on July 3rd, but Allied fighters intercepted the formation and drove it away before it could repeat the previous day's attack. That gave the Americans another day to continue their preparations. The fighter cover over Rendova had grown stronger since the disaster of July 2nd. Combat air patrols were now being coordinated more effectively. Raiders' regiers at Guadalcanal and other Allied positions were feeding information into the network. American and Allied pilots flying F-4U Corsairs, P-38 Lightnings, P-40 Warhawks, and F-6F Hellcats were rotating through cover missions over the Central Solomons. The Japanese air commanders in the region had noticed the change. They were beginning to understand that the pattern of easy raids they had enjoyed for 18 months was ending, but they were not yet ready to concede the sky. Not while the American beachhead on Rendova sat exposed. Not while there were still targets they could reach. They planned another strike, a larger one. On the morning of July 4th, Rendova had something it had not possessed on the 2nd. Allied combat air patrols were operating over the area. The Battery E fire control radar, the SCR-268B, was operating. The 90mm M1 guns of the 9th Defense Battalion were manned and ready. Their crews had rehearsed loading and firing sequences until the movements lived below thought. High explosive shells fitted with mechanical time fuses were stacked in the ready racks and in reserve. The crews used mechanical time fuses, not proximity fuses. Whatever happened over Rendova on the afternoon of July 4th would happen through radar data, mechanical calculation, steady hands, and disciplined fire. The mechanical time fuse was an older technology. It had been developed in the years before the war, and it worked on a simple principle. A small mechanical clockwork inside the fuse was set by the fuse setter to detonate the shell a specified number of seconds after firing. If the fuse setter set it correctly, and if the gun crew fired at the correct moment, and if the shell traveled at the expected velocity, the round would explode at approximately the right altitude to threaten the target. That was a lot of ifs. The proximity fuse, which would eventually revolutionize anti-aircraft warfare, worked differently. It contained a small radio transmitter and receiver, and it detonated automatically when the shell came within lethal range of a solid object. No timing, no calculation, just proximity, and the round went off. But the proximity fuse was not yet in service with these guns on Rendova. That would come later. In the summer of 1943, the American Marines defending Suicide Point had only their mechanical time fuses, their director, their radar, and their training. That would have to be enough. 400 miles to the northwest, Japanese commanders at Rabaul were preparing another strike, using aircraft operating from bases to the northwest of Rendova. Japanese commanders were attempting to repeat the success of the July 2nd raid and strike the crowded Rendova beachhead again. They had no apparent reason to expect the level of radar-directed fire that awaited them. At approximately 1:50 in the afternoon on July 4, 1943, according to one official American Marine account, the warning radar on Rendova detected more than 80 enemy aircraft inbound from the northwest. The reports moved through the fire control center. Alerts went out across the island. The Battery E gun crews received their standby order. The Allied fighters overhead were vectored to intercept. Some sources indicate the incoming force consisted of roughly 17 bombers flying at approximately 8,000 feet, with a much larger fighter escort, perhaps 66 aircraft, at nearly 15,000 feet. Other summary histories reduced the bomber count to 16. The precise composition of the Japanese formation would remain a matter of record-keeping and dispute for decades. Different sources on both sides recorded different numbers. Different aircraft types were reported by different observers. The fog of war extended into the archives long after the war itself had ended. Despite those conflicting records, the broad outline of the engagement is clear. Allied fighters engaged the Japanese escort and bomber force before it reached Rendova. Only a fraction of the attacking formation broke through to the island. The fighter action itself was a violent thing, though most of it happened outside the sight of the American Marines on the ground. Corsairs and Lightnings and other Allied fighters climbed into a Japanese formation that outnumbered them, and they attacked. They broke up the escort. They forced the Japanese fighters to defend themselves. They created gaps in the protective umbrella around the bombers, and they exploited those gaps to fire on the medium bombers themselves. Some Japanese aircraft went down before the formation ever reached the beach. Some Allied aircraft went down too. Neither side kept a perfect count of what happened in those minutes in the skies northwest of Rendova. What both sides knew by the time the surviving Japanese bombers pressed on toward the target was that the attack had been degraded before it could be delivered. Below that fighting, the bomber formation pressed on toward the beach. Across Rendova, 90mm M1 anti-aircraft guns had been laid onto their expected engagement zone. Elevation wheels were set. Fuse setters watched their dial. Battery E's SCR-268B tracked the descending bombers and fed range and bearing data into the Sperry M4 director. The director translated the data into firing solutions. The solutions began to feed the guns. At approximately 2:10 in the afternoon, a 40mm automatic gun on Rendova opened fire. Within seconds, other anti-aircraft weapons across the island joined the barrage. 20mm cannons, water-cooled 50 caliber machine guns, additional 40mm, and, most importantly, the radar-directed 90mm guns of Battery E. The guns fired in salvos, following the changing solutions from the Sperry M4 director as the bomber formation moved. Over Rendova, black bursts began to appear within the bomber formation. Not behind it, not below it, inside it. Bombers continued toward the target, despite the anti-aircraft bursts forming around them. Then the formation entered a large cloud. Captain William Tracy of the 9th Defense Battalion later recalled that the bursts were directly on target. His recollection, preserved in an official American Marine Corps history, captures the engagement in a single image. The formation entered the cloud. Pieces of aircraft fell out beneath it. That is a picture worth staying with for a moment, because it captures something that had almost never happened in the anti-aircraft war of the previous 18 months. The bursts had not simply been near the target. They had been in the target. The rounds had detonated where the bombers were flying, at the altitude they were flying, in the space they were about to occupy. And when the formation had disappeared into a cloud, what came out beneath it was no longer aircraft. The Marines on the ground saw it. Their commanding officers saw it. Whatever else they had expected on the afternoon of July 4th, they had not expected to see enemy bombers coming apart in mid-air over their heads. Across the island, the guns kept firing. The attack was disrupted. Of the 16 bombers described in American accounts, only 4 succeeded in releasing their bombs over the target. Their bombs fell on Rendova. 6 Americans were killed, including 1 Marine officer. 13 were wounded, including 3 enlisted Marines. 2 landing craft infantry were holed and had to be beached to keep them from sinking. A fuel dump was destroyed. Vehicles and supplies were damaged. This was not a bloodless victory. But it was a victory. Every one of those American dead was real. Every one of the wounded had a name, a family, a story that would continue in some form even if he did not. The 6 who died on July 4th were not statistics. They were young men whose luck ran out on a beach in the South Pacific because 4 Japanese bombers, out of 16, had managed to get their loads away before the sky came down on them. The men on Rendova, when the shooting stopped, did not celebrate. They counted their own losses. They counted their expended rounds. They looked at the wreckage in Blanche Channel and understood, without anyone having to tell them, that something had happened that afternoon that had never quite happened before. By the time the firing ended, Battery E's radar-directed 90mm guns had expended a total of only 88 rounds. 88 rounds. American Marine histories credited the 9th Defense Battalion with destroying 12 bombers, while some unit accounts associated the extraordinary 88-round expenditure specifically with Battery E's radar-directed guns. One official American Marine Corps monograph, drawing on Japanese records available to its authors, stated that the Japanese admitted losing 11 aircraft. The exact tally and the division of credit between American units and between anti-aircraft fire and Allied fighter action remained disputed. The reported ratio was extraordinary. On the basis of the American claim, the figure amounted to roughly 1 credited bomber for every 7 90mm rounds expended. Contemporary American Marine accounts proclaimed it a world record for rounds expended per aircraft credited. Whether or not it was truly unmatched anywhere in the war, the achievement was extraordinary by any measure. Anti-aircraft fire in 1943 had until then been considered effective if it forced enemy formations to break their attack runs. Actual destruction of aircraft in the kind of ratios Rendova claimed on July 4th was almost unheard of. To put those numbers in perspective, anti-aircraft units in Europe and the Pacific were commonly firing hundreds or even thousands of rounds per credited kill. The rate of ammunition expenditure across all Allied anti-aircraft forces in the middle years of the war was measured in thousands to 1. Ratios of a few dozen rounds per credited aircraft were considered exceptional. Ratios of single digits belonged to a category the doctrine did not really know how to talk about. The 9th Defense Battalion, on the afternoon of July 4, 1943, had produced a ratio that anti-aircraft gunners of any nation, in any theater, would have considered impossible if they had not seen the wreckage themselves. Even more extraordinary was what the guns had prevented. The strike that Japanese commanders had launched to smash the American beachhead again, to burn the supply ships, to silence the long toms that would soon pound Munda across the channel, was broken over Rendova. The engagement entered the battalion's reports and later its official American Marine Corps history as one of the most remarkable anti-aircraft claims of the Central Solomons campaign. The result demonstrated what radar, mechanical fire control, trained crews, and coordinated anti-aircraft defenses could achieve under combat conditions. Exactly how many aircraft each element destroyed remained disputed, but the Japanese attack had clearly been broken. Japanese air activity continued, but the July 4th action became the last sizable daylight assault on Rendova. Later attacks were conducted largely at night and often by smaller numbers of aircraft. The consequences of that shift moved outward like ripples in dark water. The American Marine Long Tom batteries continued their round-the-clock fire across Blanche Channel. The stronger air defense network reduced the danger of another daylight disaster like the raid of July 2nd. Although Japanese air attacks did not end, their 155mm shells arched over the water day and night, pounding the airfield at Munda, pounding the Japanese trenches and pillboxes and command posts. The 155mm Long Tom was, in its own way, as important a weapon at Rendova as the 90mm M1. It was the largest towed field gun in the American arsenal. It could throw a 95-pound projectile more than 15 miles. When the crews at Rendova traversed their tubes across Blanche Channel and began registering targets on Munda, they were reaching into an area the Japanese had thought was safe. They were making the Japanese airfield uninhabitable by day. They were killing the men who tried to work on the runway. They were destroying the aircraft that tried to disperse into revetments. They were doing at long range and with brutal efficiency what a much larger ground attack would have had to do at much greater cost. The Long Toms could only do that work because the sky over Rendova was safe. The sky over Rendova was safe because of the 90mm guns of the 9th Defense Battalion. Munda Airfield fell on August 5th, 1 month and 1 day after the July 4th engagement. The strategic objective for which Americans had already died on Rendova was now in American hands. American engineers had the runway operational within days. Allied aircraft operating from Munda could now reach targets that had been beyond practical range only weeks earlier. The road up the Solomons toward Bougainville was open. Beginning in early August, elements of the 9th Defense Battalion moved from Rendova to the Munda area to defend the newly captured airfield and its surroundings. Japanese daylight attacks continued to diminish across the region, but night raids persisted. Night raids were a different kind of war. They came in ones and twos rather than in formations. They were harder to intercept because Allied fighters at that stage of the war were still learning how to operate against enemy aircraft in darkness. They were often more of a nuisance than a serious threat. But they kept the anti-aircraft crews at their guns through nights when they might otherwise have slept. They wore men down. They killed a few here and a few there. They kept the war going in the smaller and quieter way that wars keep going when the great battles are elsewhere. On the night of September 14th to 15th, 1943, enemy aircraft kept the battalion's gun crews at battle stations throughout the night. The 90mm guns fired 3,378 rounds in that single engagement, credited with 1 aircraft destroyed and with forcing many other Japanese bombers to jettison their loads short of their targets. 3,300 rounds in 1 night, a far cry from the 88 of July 4th. But the mission was different. The Japanese were no longer sending confident formations into radar-controlled fire in broad daylight. They were probing at night, and even then most of them were being turned back or forced to release their loads uselessly. The 7,300 rounds fired over the course of that 1 night were not wasted. They forced the Japanese to change their tactics. They made every raid an ordeal for the Japanese air crews. They prevented most of the bombs from landing where they had been intended to land, and they cost the Empire of Japan more of its dwindling supply of trained air crews and irreplaceable aircraft. By the end of the Central Solomons campaign, the 9th Defense Battalion had been credited with 40 aircraft across 159 fire missions in 59 days of combat. 12 of those credits came on a single afternoon in July, off a beach the American Marines had once called Suicide Point. For its service at Guadalcanal, Rendova, New Georgia, and Guam, the battalion was awarded the Navy Unit Commendation. Shire's leadership during the campaign was formally recognized. The individual gun crews never became household names, even though the battalion's collective service was formally recognized. Anti-aircraft work in the American Marine Defense Battalions was considered part of the ordinary duty of those units. Defense battalions did not attract the same public attention as infantry regiments landing on hostile beaches under machine gun fire. They did not produce the same photographs, the same headlines, the same story arcs. They stood at their guns, they shot down aircraft. They kept the airfields open and the supply ships unloading and the artillery firing. That was the job. There was a certain kind of American Marine in the Pacific War whose service could not easily be translated into the language of heroism the country understood. The infantryman on the beach at Tarawa dying in the surf with a bullet through his chest became an image that Americans could carry. The Marine aviator shooting down enemy fighters over Bougainville became an ace whose name might make the news. But the anti-aircraft gunner standing at his post through night after night of raids, doing his job with quiet competence, keeping the airfield alive so that other men could fly from it, was harder to picture. There was no single moment of glory. There was only the accumulated work, hour after hour, month after month, year after year. That work mattered. It just did not photograph well. Their achievement appeared in American Marine histories and in unit records, but it never became one of the Pacific War's widely retold stories. In September of 1944, the American Marine Corps reorganized its defense battalions. The 9th Defense Battalion was redesignated the 9th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion. Its men continued serving on Guam as part of the island's anti-aircraft defenses. Guam was another kind of assignment. The island had been in American hands for less than a year when the men of the former 9th Defense Battalion arrived. The invasion had been costly. The mopping up operations against isolated Japanese soldiers holed up in the jungle continued for months. And the anti-aircraft defense of Guam was becoming increasingly important as the Marianas became the primary base for the American strategic bombing of Japan. B-29 superfortresses, the largest bombers of the war, were operating from airfields on Guam and its neighboring island. Japanese air raids against those airfields, though rare, could not be allowed to succeed. Every bomber destroyed on the ground at Guam was a bomber that would not fly against a Japanese city. The anti-aircraft defenders of the Marianas held one of the quieter but more consequential positions of the late Pacific War. When the war ended in 1945, the men of the battalion, now the 9th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion, formerly the 9th Defense Battalion, waited for the ships that would take them home. They returned to towns and cities across the United States. To farms, factories, families, and lives interrupted by war. They took off their uniforms. Like many veterans of the Pacific War, some members of the battalion spoke openly about their service, while others rarely discussed it. The reasons for that silence were as varied as the men themselves. Some had seen things they could not describe to anyone who had not been there. Some had lost friends whose faces they still saw in their sleep. Some had done their duty and moved on and did not think of the war as the most important thing about them. Some talked about it only when they were alone with other veterans in the language veterans use with each other, which is often no language at all. There were reunions, there were letters, there were postcards sent between men who had served together, exchanged over years until one by one they stopped coming. There were photographs kept in boxes in attics. For decades, the specific story of the afternoon of July 4, 1943, on Rendova Island remained the kind of thing you could find in a specialized unit history in the official volumes of the American Marine Corps CCC, in a caption in the archives at Quantico, but not in the front of the mind of the American public. The great story of the Pacific War, as most Americans came to remember it in the decades after 1945, was the story of the great battles: Pearl Harbor, Midway, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Hiroshima, the islands whose names had entered the national vocabulary, the images that had appeared on the newsreels, the stories that had been told and told again and told once more until they had become the standard version of what had happened. Rendova was not on that list. Neither was Munda, neither was most of the Central Solomons campaign. Neither were the men who had defended a small muddy island against everything the Empire of Japan sent at them, and who had turned the sky over Suicide Point into a killing ground on the afternoon of the American nation's birthday. They knew what they had done. Their commanders knew. The archives knew. But the country they had served in the years after the war moved on to other stories. That was how it had always worked. That was how it would always work. That was the price of doing a job that did not photograph well. In early 1995, an archivist at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, opened a letter from a former American Marine named Evan Evans. The letter was simple. Evans was looking for a photograph of the kind of 90mm anti-aircraft gun he had operated during the war. He mentioned, without emphasis, that he had served on Rendova. The archivist's name was Alan Walker. Walker went back into the stacks. The National Archives at College Park is one of the largest collections of historical records in the world. Its shelves hold the paperwork of the American federal government going back to the founding of the Republic. In its motion picture and photography sections are millions of images, films, and combat photographs collected across every war the country has fought. Somewhere in that vast collection is the American Marine Corps Combat Photography Series, designated 127GW. He searched the American Marine Corps Combat Photography Series, designated 127GW. He found something Evans had not asked for. He found a photograph of Evans himself. The image showed 3 American Marines standing beside a 90mm gun on Rendova Island. The typed caption identified them by name: Private First Class Evan Evans, Private Roy E. Boone, Private First Class John S. Jemborowski. The caption stated that the gun in the photograph was one of the anti-aircraft guns that had wiped out a Japanese bomber fleet during the raid at Rendova. Walker mailed a copy of the photograph to Evan Evans. Evans wrote back. He said he had never expected the archives to contain a photograph of himself. He said seeing it had brought back a flood of memories and emotions. He thanked the archivist. More than 50 years after Rendova, the photograph ensured that the men beside the gun would not remain anonymous. Private First Class Evan Evans, Private Roy E. Boone, Private First Class John S. Jemborowski, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel William J. Shire of the 9th Defense Battalion, United States Marine Corps. They were young Marines when the photograph was taken, performing the work their unit had been sent to Rendova to do. Their gun was one of the weapons belonging to Battery E, whose 90mm cruise expended 88 rounds during the engagement. Their battery commander later recalled seeing pieces of aircraft fall from the cloud. They had been part of something extraordinary. On an afternoon when almost everything had gone wrong on the 2nd and almost everything went right on the 4th, they had been at their guns. They had been part of the barrage. And more than half a century later, when one of them wrote a simple letter to an archive asking for a picture of a gun, the country he had served returned to him something he had not asked for. The country returned to him proof that it remembered. There is a lesson in that story that goes beyond the 9th Defense Battalion, beyond the Central Solomons campaign, beyond even the Pacific War itself. The lesson is that the record survives, not always in the public consciousness, not always in the front of the mind of the nation, but somewhere in some archive, in some caption on some photograph, the record of what was done is kept. The names of the men who did it are preserved. The date, the place, the unit, the action, the outcome. All of it is written down. All of it is stored. All of it is waiting for someone to come looking for it. Alan Walker had gone looking for a picture of a 90mm gun. What he found was an entire chapter of the Pacific War that most of the country had forgotten. He found 3 young Americans standing beside a weapon that had helped change the mathematics of anti-aircraft warfare. He found a photograph that had been taken more than 50 years earlier, when its subjects had no idea it would ever be looked at again by anyone. He found evidence that the work these men had done on that afternoon in that place had been noticed and recorded and filed away against a future in which someone might want to know. That is what archives do. That is why archives matter. The doctrine of radar-directed anti-aircraft fire that the 9th Defense Battalion had helped to prove out on Rendova became one of the standard patterns of American air defense for the rest of the war. Later engagements using improved radars and eventually the proximity fuse would produce even more devastating results. American anti-aircraft fire at Iwo Jima, at Okinawa, and later at the fleet defending against kamikaze attacks would draw on lessons that had been paid for in the Central Solomons. The gun crews on Rendova had done more than shoot down a formation of Japanese bombers. They had shown what the system could do. They had helped prove out a doctrine that would eventually protect American forces across the entire Pacific. None of that was their intention. Their intention had been to survive the afternoon of July 4th and to keep the beach behind them from becoming another suicide point. They had done both and something more. That is the true story of the afternoon Rendova's radar was working. That is the true story of Battery E and the 88 rounds. That is the story of the American Marines who manned the guns defending the beach the Americans called Suicide Point. The names of the 3 men in the photograph belong now to the historical record. Private First Class Evan Evans, Private Roy E. Boone, Private First Class John S. Jemborowski, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel William J. Shayer, 9th Defense Battalion, United States Marine Corps, Rendova Island. 4th of July 1943. There were many more men in that battalion whose names do not appear in this story. There were radar operators, there were fire directors, there were loaders and rammers and fuse setters whose faces are lost to us now. There were signalmen and cooks and drivers and clerks. There were the men of Battery A and Battery C whose 90mm guns fired alongside Battery E. There were the men of the 20mm and 40mm and 50 caliber batteries whose fire was part of the same barrage. All of them belonged to the same story. All of them stood on the same beach. All of them on the afternoon of July 4th, 1943, did their job well enough that most of them lived to go home. That is the whole story. That is what the records preserve. That is what the archives keep. If someone in your family served in the Pacific, tell us their name in the comments below. First name, last name, where they were from. We read everyone. That is how the memory stays alive. That is how these American Marines, and everyone who fought beside them, keep their place in the country they gave everything to protect. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. We will see you in the next story.